Thanks, Carrie. Right, so where are we? Nope. So where am I going? Whoop. Okay, there we are. Welcome back. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, I tried to play a brief video and the sound wasn't working. So I'm going to try again because I promised you that you'd get to hear this video. Can you hear it?
No.
Wait a minute. Stop. Okay. 2 of you said you cannot hear it. Is your computer volume up?
Yeah.
But Asha, you heard it.
I heard something. Heard something.
Hold on, hold on, hold on.
I could not hear it, Susan.
Okay. Let's try this. We'll try one more time.
And I'm in the 6th grade. I was invited to go to a school board meeting to get an award, but I didn't know what the school board did. So I asked my grandpa Freddie, since he used to be on the board. He said, well, school boards are kind of like the grandparents of the schools.
They want good things for the students and staff. Even though grandparents aren't always around, we do our best to help you learn and grow. Let me see if I can explain it in another way. Think of the school board team as building a bridge between the community and the schools. They are your voice. Board members listen to parents, community members, school staff, and even the students about their hopes and dreams for their schools. They share these messages with the superintendent and other school leaders, and they advocate for their school district by speaking up for them with other elected officials and within the community. Another important job of the board is to provide direction for the schools. School board members choose a destination for the district. They might like the students to go to Topeka, Kansas, Paris, France, or even Mars. But they don't tell the staff how to get there. They empower the superintendent, staff, and students to choose their path. The board also makes a lot of decisions, like hiring a superintendent. The superintendent is the leader who makes sure the daily operations of the schools run well. The superintendent helps determine the best routes on the map, along with the staff and students. The school board also ensures that resources are in place so that the staff can complete their work and make sure students can reach their destinations. Let's say that the schools want their students to be able to play a musical instrument if they'd like, or fix a car, or understand algebra or other opportunities. The board makes sure that the school district has the money, staff, and materials in the right places at the right time. To ensure success, the board and superintendent team help students complete their journey in their local schools and prepare them for the future.
After talking to Grandpa Freddie, I had a much better understanding of what school boards do. They build a bridge so that the community and the schools can communicate, and they set destinations for the schools so that I can reach my goals. The school board looks out for me, just like my grandpa and grandma do.
So as I mentioned last week, that was prepared by my counterpart in Texas. And while the laws in Texas about school boards are different than Vermont's, fundamentally boards serve the same purpose. And the term that we wrap around it is governance. And perhaps you've heard that term in use around your board. And if you haven't, I'm guessing you will. And it's one of those words that everybody throws around without necessarily really understanding it. And so my little way to help clarify it is to differentiate governing from managing. So governing is more about policies and big picture, and managing is about operations and day-to-day stuff. And that's the job of administration. So school boards really have three big chunks, if you will. One is hiring the right superintendent for your district. And if you're in a district that has both multiple districts in an SU, in a supervisory union, it's real technically it's the supervisory union board that hires the superintendent. Now, the supervisory union board is made up of board members from the member boards, so everybody has a voice in that respect. And the superintendent oversees all of the boards, works with all of the boards, and ultimately has responsibility for all of the schools, but it's through different channels, whereas in a fully integrated supervisory district, there's one superintendent, multiple schools, probably in multiple towns, and they all operate through one board. So those structures vary around the state. It's a result of Act 46, which you probably are still hearing about, even though that technically was finished in implementation last year or 2 years ago, actually. So are there any questions about that? So this role of the school board, I love comparing it to grandparents, right? You know they're important in your kids' lives, and sometimes they get a little too close. I don't know if any of you have grandparents who live nearby. They can be the best thing, right? Natural babysitter right there when you need them. They give you moral support, but every once in a while they overstep, right? And school boards tend to work the same way. And so it's a good idea to be a little bit conservative as the grandparent and not show up when you haven't been invited. I am learning that with my partner has grandchildren who live nearby. And so we never just pop in unannounced. We let them know, it's just respectful. And the same is true between boards and the superintendent. So that's one big chunk, one of the first and most important things a school board needs to do for a successful district. Another is to establish policies. And are any of you serving on your board's policy committee? Okay. And so policies, for the most part, districts already have policies in place. There may be some exceptions to those that are newly consolidated in the last couple of years where they're still working on their policy manuals. And then it's incumbent on the board and with the help of administration to monitor that those policies remain impactful and, more importantly, remain important. In addition, periodically there's legislation that comes out of Montpelier that requires a new policy. And when that happens, VSBA will keep you apprised of that and actually provide for you a model policy, which you can adopt as is once you fill in the name of your school district, or use as a base for modification. But if you're going to change it, what we give out has been vetted by attorneys to make sure that it is consistent with the laws. If you're going to start from scratch or even modify those, it's certainly your prerogative to do so, but then you will want to clear them with your district's attorney. And the third piece is money. Money's big. And so the board has a couple of different roles and where money's concerned, and we'll get to that. Barbara, you don't need to use the chat, just speak up.
Cool. So does the board also do any evaluation on the effectiveness of the policy implementation?
So
Go
that's kind of where you cross that line. So the board creates policies and the administration creates
Implements.
the procedures. So,
Right.
and depending on the way things are done in your district, and as we were just talking about, it can really vary widely. The range of how deeply into the implementation weeds the board gets is local. ideally, the board stays out of the implementation, and the procedures are designed by the superintendent and implemented through the rest of the administration to the school level.
So if in fact, is there any process where we do any kind of evaluation that we got the desired outcome? Or we basically do the policy and then we kind of wash our hands and move on?
Well, no, because you're going to be monitoring your students' performance, you
Okay.
monitoring other data like your retention rate of your faculty, if it's something having to do with staffing, or your graduation rates, or you know, there are a lot of different metrics that the board watches. So think of it as the board comes first and last.
Okay,
Okay, the board comes first because you set the vision and create the policies to move you toward that vision. And then you monitor the performance to make sure that the intent of your policies is moving you where you want to go. And that's why we recommend that all policies get reviewed every 3 years. And so if you keep that on a sort of rotating basis, you take a third of your policies every year and review them. Most of them probably won't need to change, and periodically you may want to update something, or you may want to create something that takes it further or curtails it. So enough said on that.
You
Yeah, Katie.
also learn, one of the ways that I feel like we monitor that is through the superintendent report that we
Right.
have every board meeting. I
So
don't know if all boards have that, but it definitely highlights the information and the percentages of things that we're looking to gain
right.
knowledge
And-
on.
And ideally, all boards have that, but the report that you see as a policy governance board is sort of scripted.
Okay,
It's got specific elements that are incorporated into that report for exactly that purpose.
okay.
And unlike the method of governance that most boards, and policy governance is maybe, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the boards in the state use some version of policy governance, and that's just totally anecdotal off the top of my head. But policy governance makes it really clear that the superintendent does all of the implementation pieces. And it's subject to a reasonable interpretation of the policies. So if your superintendent under policy governance is interpreting something really differently, then it leads to the outcomes that the board intended. Then you create another policy called a limitation policy. So the basic premise is you start with the really big stuff in your policies, and you narrow it down as much as you need to, but no more than you need to, in order to make sure that the superintendent and the board are marching in the same direction.
Okay.
Is that helpful? Okay. So those are and then the budget, the numbers, that's another big piece of the board's responsibilities, right? Because you're working with your district business manager and superintendent to establish a budget. Then the board adopts it, the board passes it, then it goes to the public. And if the public approves it, that then becomes the budget that you're going to live with for the rest of the year or for the next year. And that means then the board's job shifts with respect to finances, and you're in a monitoring role at that point. And so again, and we'll talk more about that because that's one of the sort of premier topics that we'll get into tonight. So this may look familiar. We talked about it last time. This is the essential work of school boards. This is the landing page from our website for what we call a toolkit, which sort of parallels and works with the book that you should have all received. That looks a lot like the one there, except I think it's a purple cover now. And so those 6 domains, as we call them, are the biggies. And tonight we were going to focus on two, but by special request, we're going to talk about the budget, and we're going to talk about the board and superintendent partnership. Those were the two that I had figured really stood out as a good place to start. But the community engagement piece came up in the discussion as we were closing up last time. So we'll head into that one first. So let me get all of this organized. There we go. So engaging the community is important, right? It's their money. And if we're talking about a community of parents, it's their children. So these are kind of the biggest things there are. So I like this quote a lot because I think as constituents of one kind of or another, we've all felt like things are done to us from some governing body, whether it's the state legislature or your town county, your select board or whoever it may be. And the idea is if your community is involved and are part of making those big decisions and they have a voice, they're going to be more engaged and be wanting to be working with the schools more. So we encourage them to be involved at that level. And we were talking a little bit before about parents wanting to come together basically for a bitch session to the board. And there's a time and place for that. I don't mean to suggest that there isn't, but when we talk about community engagement in this way, we're really talking about something much more proactive and not reactive. And that's a really hard thing because basically what it's saying is, okay, I'm going to do everything I need to do as a board member, but as a board, we're also going to reach out and ask our community to tell us what they want. And then we're going to listen. And most of the time, board members, especially people who've been sitting on their boards a long time, they think of community engagement as the people who show up at their meetings. Well, I don't know how many meetings you all have had a chance to go to. How many people have been in the audience? Yeah, Barbara? A handful, right? At best. And that's only because Zoom is convenient. Once you're in person, if things are going well, you rarely have an audience. They may be at home watching on TV if you broadcast, but I don't know if you've ever tried to watch a board meeting on TV. It's kind of like watching paint dry. And, I doubt very much that people really stay captively engaged. So making this feel like theirs, right? Making the schools feel as though they're part of the community and the community is part of the schools, and the education decisions that are being made at a high level is really valuable, right? It gets everybody marching in the same direction. And it makes sure that you as that bridge to the community in the video, it makes sure that you really do have your finger on the pulse of what the community wants. But if you only are listening to the people who show up at your board meetings, you're not getting a representative sampling of your community or probably what they want or what their values are. So reaching out and listening is the hard part. And it takes a lot of commitment and repeated efforts to get people to really engage. I mean, here's a good example. Okay, there are over 100 new board members this year, and there are 4 of you here.
Wow.
Okay, and you all have stepped up. You're the ones on the front lines. So imagine the parents who, or taxpayers, even more so, who don't feel connected to the schools. They're not going to come unless they're specifically invited to, and meant to feel welcome and meant to feel like this is for them to be able to participate and communicate and affect change. That, if people feel valued, and they feel ownership, it changes their relationship to the schools. So you want to partner with your community. You really do need them in order to move forward, not just when it comes time to vote on the budget, but there's movement in education now for more community-based learning opportunities, whether it's local businesses or it's mentorships or it's lots of different possibilities. And without having the communities involved and the people in the communities involved, those things become a lot harder. So when you have public showing up at your board meeting, they're not there for that purpose. They're there because they have something specific that they want to tell you. And a lot of boards will hold public forums around, say, around budget time so they can share out with the community why the numbers are what they are. But that informing, while that's part of community engagement, I'm going to say it's almost the secondary part. It's really important that you listen. So, and you have a role in educating them too. You have a role to educate them about what the experts in education tell us are important things to watch or changes that are coming, or maybe if you have a high school, your students aren't taking advantage of some of the statewide programs like early college, and you see those statistics and you wonder why not. So you want to pull together a group of students. You want to talk to your juniors and seniors and ask why they're not taking advantage of that, or talk to their parents. Those are meaningful engagements.
So as school board members, obviously this would have to be done as a board as a whole,
Yes.
right? You can have those dialogues into the school, like specific dialogues with specific, students, is what you're saying.
Yeah, you can, absolutely. But it's done as a board. It's warned as a public meeting. Everybody's invited, or you can invite select people and keep, but everybody has to be able to attend because it's a public meeting.
Right. Okay.
Okay. And boards are learning, and this is sort of newly evolving, about student voice. There are some boards who believe that students ought to have a voice in their own education, and there are others who are not ready for that yet. And I'm not going to tell you that one is good and one is bad. It's a process, and it's hard sometimes to move from those things. How many of you have students on your boards?
We do.
We do.
Okay.
We have one.
Okay.
We have two, and they are like the most enlightening individuals. I've learned so much information from them as a new board member, just as far as the expectations of students, what's really happening in school, and how far removed our experiences are from what they're experiencing.
It's really helpful to have a window into that.
What concerns me is our rep hardly ever says anything. And I believe that's a shadow of the leadership. If in fact they aren't saying and contributing, having been in management myself, there's this phrase, shadow of the leader. And it concerns me, right? That they attend, and if asked a specific question, they might respond, but the individual barely says anything. And so there's no insight.
Have you had a conversation with your board chair about that?
I haven't yet. So, and I didn't think too much about it until you just, and Katie talked about how her board rep, her student rep, and I'm like, oh shoot, I would love to see that.
She asks the hardest questions, and in some ways, there's just a couple of us that still have kids in school. So she's not far removed from our experience as parents with the age range isn't that. And sometimes I have questions in my brain that I haven't quite formulated. And these two representatives just constantly are asking questions of the superintendent, of
Wow.
the board chair, of guests, of principals that are reporting out. There's no veil or any kind of hand.
Wow. That's
not.
awesome.
She speaks freely and more than we do.
Wow.
And
That's
that really varies by board, its personality,
Right.
but it's also legacy. It's also how the board has incorporated the student members into the board. And I certainly wouldn't recommend this until after you've spoken to the chair, but if you're still finding that that's the case, it's not inappropriate for in a discussion for you as a board member to say, boy, I'd really like to hear what Jane thinks.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. It's interesting because prior to this year, the board members actually didn't ask hardly any questions. So there's 3 new members and we ask questions.
Mhm.
And I think it annoys the older board members because it drags out the meeting because we're asking questions about various things that are being presented. So that's why I said the shadow of the leader a little bit, the legacy of the board, like you said.
Right.
But that I think is definitely something that I need to pursue. And I understand talking to the chair first.
Yeah. And one of the questions that came up at the end of our last session was to talk a little bit more about the role of the chair relative to other board members. So later on, we're going to talk about the board and superintendent relationship. And if I lose that train and about the chair, remind me, because that really would fit in there.
Okay,
Susan,
excellent.
Are there resources for the student representatives? Like, is there a sub tier of what we do where they can communicate or have mentorship with each other?
Well, there isn't. And because it's not, because
Official.
not every board has student reps, we don't even always know who does and who doesn't, much less who they are. And so as much as I would like to create that, we have incomplete data that makes it really difficult. But I will tell you, I have been blown away by the students, the same kind of reaction Katie's talking about, when we have them come. And we had one group, it was the board chair, the superintendent, and one student from one district who came and addressed a training session a few weeks ago of board chairs and superintendents, and that student just blew everybody away.
Wow.
She was so dynamic and so confident and charming with a sense of humor. And not all kids know how to talk to adults. And so for those kids, this is an amazing opportunity. But to answer your question, Katie, we did, for that particular program, we did just update the VSBA's Guide to Student Voice, which is accessible through our website under resources, the new version. And it helps to, so Barbara, that might be something to also share with your chair and say, we were talking about this at my training and this came up and this is newly revised. And maybe we're not really maximizing our student representatives
Right.
input here.
And I think what I'll do, because we have a policy that we implemented a year ago or so, so I'll take a look at that and compare it to what's been revised as well.
Perfect.
So it's good.
How about Asha and Dan? Do you have student reps on your boards? No.
We do not, but we would like to have them. So I'm just jotted down a couple of notes. I've got a couple questions for our chair.
Okay, and again, that student guide, sort of student voice, guide to student voice, sort of walks you through preparing for that eventuality. There's some information about how the student reps are selected around the state, which again varies. In some cases, they're appointed by the administration. In some cases, they're the student council reps. In some cases, they're elected by the student body. It's all across the board. And so at least you have something a little bit more tangible to bounce around rather than starting off with a blank slate and not knowing which foot to put forward first. So I hope you find it helpful. And there's also guidance in there for the student who becomes a board member or who's thinking of applying to become a board member. So it's a pretty handy tool for that very specific thing. I encourage you to take a look at it. So I mentioned over financial responsibilities of boards. Let me just start with a quick show of hands. How many of you work with numbers all day, every day? Okay.
I have in the past,
Okay.
but I don't do now.
And how many would say you're comfortable with numbers? Household budgets, whatever. Okay. Any of you like mathophobics?
I was a math major.
Okay. So you would not be a mathophobic. There are people who are. And there are school board members who are. And so if you are not among them, I encourage you to pay attention when you get into the conversations around budget and around the numbers, whether it's establishing the budget or monitoring it, to make sure that your fellow board members are comfortable with financial statements. I had a business partner who didn't read financial statements, refused to look at them. And luckily I'm honest, because I could have taken her for a ride. I would never do such a thing, but she didn't get it and didn't want to get it. And there are adults who are really that math averse. And so when you're looking at financial statements for millions of dollars, that can really mess some people's heads. And so if you're in a position to be able to help out with that, that's appreciated. And one other thing I forgot to mention about students on the board, and this is germane to that also. Somebody asked, Katie, you asked if there's a network for them, and there isn't, but we do really recommend that you appoint a board member to be the mentor, to help ease those students into the board process and be able to answer their questions offline about why things went down the way they did, or how the things work and who votes on what, and when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to ask questions and what kinds of questions, etc.
Also, just to put it out there, my board also has mentorship for new board members.
Yay, I'm so happy to hear that. That is something
I started. I'm really the first class of that, but it's been super helpful.
And we don't do anything like that.
Yeah, we've encouraged it in the past and don't actively encourage it always, because a lot of boards are still holding on to some old stuff. And then the mentorship really just reinforces bad practices.
Right.
So, and I really have wanted over the last year to start up a member-to-member online chat vehicle through our website, but there's some legal complications there, and I haven't quite figured out how to get past all of that. But so that if you have a question about something that your board is dealing with, probably somebody else has already confronted that and dealt with it, like, do you have student members on your board? Those kinds of conversations. And so I haven't given up on that, but it has sort of fallen down on the priority list. So I won't belabor the point, because you're all comfortable with numbers, and that's wonderful. So your role as far as the budget goes is that that's where the rubber meets the road for your taxpayers, right? And so here's a complicating, well, education funding in Vermont, if you haven't looked into it,
It's
is
complicated.
the biggest rat's nest you're ever going to find. It stems from a 20-year-old, 22-year-old court decision based on our state constitution that every child is entitled to a good quality education, which is kind of cool that that's built right into the, into the state constitution. And so a student in a rural district, her family sued the state of Vermont saying, hey, we're in this small school in a rural district. We don't get all the opportunities. So 20 some years ago, the legislature completely revamped the way education is funded in Vermont. It is no longer directly property taxes pay for the schools, which is the old model. It now makes several calculations attempting to equalize the value that the students are getting in different towns. There is a video on our website, again, under resources, called Education Funding Video. And it's about 11.5 minutes long. And I encourage you to take a look at it, because essentially what happens this is a very, very simplified version of what happens, but all the schools in the state adopt budgets. The state then figures out how much money is needed beyond the other sources of revenue to pay for the schools. And then turns that into a per student spending based on weighted student counts. And if I'm making no sense to you, raise your hand and I'll define any of these terms. And then adjusts it based on the relative property values of the community, so that theoretically, you're paying, your tax rate is determined based on a calculation or a rate provided by the legislature through the tax department, and then adjusted for your per student spending and also your property values. And that's how that number shows up on your tax bill. Part of the evolution of this complicated plan is that we now are required, when we're talking to our communities about budgets, we're required to present them as per pupil spending. Now, if you are in a district where your pupil count is going down, as many in Vermont are, that means without changing a thing, your per pupil spending goes up, right? Automatically, because you divide it by fewer students. And that's where some of our tax rates have gotten a little bit out of control. And I wasn't there at the time, and I don't want to pretend I'm a fortune teller, but I would guess that part of the motivation for Act 46 and the consolidation of school districts was to make sure that all students had opportunity, even if it meant a school might be better off closing and consolidating students in one building for the sake of efficiency, which then brings the per pupil spending back down. Because as I was constantly reminded when I was on a board by the administrators, when you lose 30 students in a year, it's not one class or two classes. You lose a couple of first graders and a couple of kindergartners and 3 second graders, and it's not enough to shrink a class. So you still have the same number of faculty and staff in the school, but you're supporting fewer kids. And that's when things start to fall apart, given this state funding formula. So I encourage you to become familiar with the education fund, which is the state dollar, it's the state bank, which is supported by local property taxes as well as rooms and meals tax and sales and use taxes and other state revenue sources, so that we're not paying 100% through our taxes. So we get this budget passed, hopefully. And I will tell you, I personally have not ever had to deal with a failed budget as a board member, where a budget fails and you have to go back to the drawing board. But that's a big challenge because you've already pared your budget as much as you think you can, and now you have to do more. So part of that process of getting the budget to pass, it falls to the board. And that's, if you've already supported that budget, you've already passed that budget. And so now is your time to talk to your community and help them understand what's in the budget, why it's so important, and how it supports your community and the kids in your schools. Okay, and then after the budget's passed and you're back up and running, your job is to monitor to make sure that money is being spent appropriately to meet your goals and to jive with your budget. And that doesn't mean you need a line by line, it doesn't have to be exactly parallel all the way down. You may have overestimated one thing and underestimated something else. So at the end of the day, you're accountable to your community for the bottom line only.
So our board, for the last year, maybe even before that, they, never in a board meeting did they go through any of the financials, like a monitoring exercise. So I'm on the finance committee now, and I asked about that, and all of a sudden they said, oh, we haven't done that. We need to do it. So I was really concerned about that. And the excuse was, well, the last year, things with the extra money coming in from the feds, it was too complicated. And also the financial system. I know there's a lot of issues with the new system that people are struggling with. But I was concerned.
I would be too.
And it was the first one. So just a couple of weeks ago, we had the first one that they've done for a long time. So with the ESSER money coming in, is the board have any kind of oversight there, at least to understand the plan of how it's going to be spent?
Yes and no. So you're accountable to your taxpayers for how their money is being spent.
Okay.
Okay, so that's number one. And the yes part is that the decision on where those monies are being spent needs to be consistent with the vision and goals that the board has established for the district. So, for example, I'll make up a crazy example. Let's say that your third grade literacy scores are really low. And there's a ton of documentation and research that's been done about third grade literacy. If students fall behind by third grade, you have a really hard time bringing them back. And the further they fall behind over time, the harder it is. So third grade literacy is something that is commonly focused on if literacy seems to be an issue in your district. So if you've identified third grade literacy, that's it. That's our priority. Focus, focus, focus. And administration comes in and wants to spend the ESSER funds on building new playing fields. That's an issue, right? Because it's not consistent with the board's priorities.
Right.
Okay, does that help answer? But you're not accountable to your community for your ESSER funds.
Right. But if they're going to hire temporary staff in the area of literacy, then it's like a good thing.
Right. Or maybe it's new curriculum or new tools to support the curriculum, maybe, I don't know, new reading programs or digital reading programs or something that they believe is going to help boost the students' outcomes in early literacy. Well, great. You have to trust their professional
Sure.
judgment on how best to support literacy. But if that's the goal, then that's the goal. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, good. So developing a budget. The board has a couple of inputs here. One is your budgeting policy, and this is not a required policy, but it's a helpful one. You also want to lay down some, and often this is the finance committee. Sometimes it's sort of more the chair in dialogue with the upper echelons, the superintendent and the business manager, that you want to make sure that your budget meets the goals, meets the directives that the board may be giving, and satisfies the community's values. So I was working with one board, and they had it was such an important thing for them. They happened to have a beautiful mountain as part of their district, and it sort of dominates life in that part of the state. And so their vision statement, their big overriding what we want for our students, included outdoor education.
Wow.
Now, that's unusual, but it made sense in their case because this is this big resource that they have. And so when it came time for budgeting, they wanted to see that reflected in the budget, right? The budget is a really, really good test to make sure that the priorities of the community and the board are reflected in the way the monies are allocated. That's a good test to make sure you're on the right path, right? And that you're heading in the right direction. And then you delegate to administration, and you can give them guidelines. You can say to them, for example, we don't want to see anything that is more than 2.5% over last year's budget. The community just won't support it. So here are our priorities. This is what we need to accomplish. Give it your best shot. Or you may want to hear, okay, we want level programming. Well, level programming means more cost, right? Because your teacher salaries are going up and the benefits are going up and the cost of everything is going up. And if you want to keep level programming, they'll come back to you and say, okay, that's going to be a 5.5% increase. And if your student population is growing, that may be sustainable for you. And your community may accept that, because a 5% budget increase, when you divide it out by more students, really is only a 2.5% increase on your cost per student, perhaps. I'm making up these numbers as I go along, obviously. So, or you can give them broad guidelines, like whatever you do, we've been in the $8 million range for the last 5 years. We cannot go above 9. We can go to 9, but not above 9. If that happens to be the will of the community. And then after you see the first pass at a budget, then it's back and forth. Well, I understand why you included this, but what about our, we really wanted to include enhanced field trips this year. And I don't see them reflected in the budget. So how can we make that happen? And then they're going to have to find something. If you're in agreement with the bottom line, then the staff is going to have to find some other places to find that money if that's really a priority. And once you get to a point where you've resolved those kinds of issues, the board will vote on the budget and then warn the budget. And the budget has to be warned, I think I don't remember exactly, but it may be 5 weeks before the town vote. And then it's customary for the board to hold community meetings to explain the budget. and to answer questions about the budget and to try to educate the public about the tax rate. You know, here's something that I said before, we're required now to talk about our budgets to the public in cost per student. And I think that's a really solid improvement, because school boards tend to talk in terms of the overall budget percent increase, decrease, whatever. But that does not translate into tax rate changes. So you could have a 1% budget decline and have a 4% tax increase. Right? And you, as the board needs to be able to explain that. And if you're comfortable with numbers, you may be the one on the board who's being asked to explain that, because maybe your chair is not so comfortable with the numbers for it, you know. And now that we're in consolidated districts that span across towns, that's being handled differently, again, by different districts. Some have an annual school meeting where all the towns combine to have that discussion. In other cases, and where I live, we vote by Australian ballot. We don't vote on the floor. And so somebody from my supervisory district who lives in my town presents at my town meeting, and somebody in the next town presents at that town meeting, and we're all getting the same information. Oh, and here's another fun one. If you have multiple towns in your school district, different towns have different tax rates
Right.
because of your real estate values. And that can be very confusing.
And the last time you've done appraisals.
Right. Well, but they use a 3-year look back window
Right.
on the property values. And so you may be at 97% of your appraisal based on how things have been selling. Although much more likely in the last few years, you're going to be at 120% of what the appraised values are, right? Real estate values in a lot of the state have gone crazy in the last year and a half. And that's going to start to figure into those rates. And that's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye on, because it will affect tax rates. Is there anything so far that we want to talk about that you guys want to
So
dig into?
the granularity of the budget,
Mhm.
I've done some research. In fact, that's kind of why I ran. You know, there's a bunch of issues I was involved with. And I've actually gone back and looked at financials for years. I've looked at enrollment numbers for years, all that kind of thing, and have them in spreadsheets and all this kind of stuff as a true math major. But it seems to me each year they get more, they summarize more. And it's really hard to understand and even compare year to year, I find. So is there any guidelines on what is the correct granularity for a budget? Like, I would have no clue if they were using, you know, putting money into outdoor field trips or, you know, whatever, if that was a goal by looking at the budget.
Then ask.
Okay.
Then ask. I mean, we periodically hear stories about how, you know, the administration increased a particular line item by a certain amount, and the board just let it pass, you know, didn't raise an issue. And it turns out that the administration was built in laptops for everybody,
Right.
and the board didn't know it. And the board ought to know something like that, just because the community is going to come to you and say, hey, my kid came home with a laptop. What's up with that? Why are we paying for that? And the board never told the community members that that was included in the budget, and because the board didn't know. So,
Right.
you know, that's where the granularity becomes important. You need to be able to answer the questions. And
Like,
in order to do that, you have to ask the question.
right. And so we have International Black Baccalaureate, right? And, you know, when you research it, it says it's a very expensive program, but, you know, even the fees for IB, there's no line item. It's nowhere. And people do ask, but they never are given answers.
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate as you're having budget meetings with your business office and your superintendent there to ask, what's the cost of the IB program? And,
Right,
and,
okay.
and are we seeing evidence that we're getting our money's worth?
Right, and that's
What is the,
I'm trying to do, right?
and
It's-
that's when
what-
you turn to the superintendent and you say, what is the evidence? And
Right.
don't, would you please develop a response and let us know at the next meeting? You can't, one thing
Right.
that is absolutely critical, and boy, this came out in spades at our recent training with board chairs and superintendents. I had a panel of 3 retiring superintendents, and I said, what's the number one thing you want to say to board members? And they said, without a doubt, and they each echoed each other, no surprises. We don't want any surprises at the board table. And so, and I when I was a new board member, I was called out by my board chair because I asked an innocent question of, well, what do you see in the school about that? And I was putting them on the spot. So you don't want to blindside your superintendent with questions. You can ask a question with an expectation of having a future response, but
Right.
not in that moment. And
Right.
and that should work both ways. The superintendent should, cooperate the same way.
Right, and that's what I've been trying to do.
Mhm.
I'm walking on eggshells because they consider me an activist. They didn't put me on committees I wanted and the whole 9 yards. But I'm still going to do my job.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I'm trying to navigate this carefully.
And
So-
so I would also, I'm going to jump over a little bit here, but that's the kind of thing to also be able to have an honest conversation with your chair about, because you don't want to be that thorn in the side, right? You
Right.
don't want to create friction for the sake of friction. So talk to your board chair and say, here are some of the things that I'm concerned about. And I have publicly available data that I've been watching. And as I analyze the data, I have big questions. And is it okay can we please have that conversation at a meeting? I think it's important that, we understand some of these fundamentals. Does that feel right to you? Right? And put yourself in the chair on the same side, I guess is what I'm
well,
saying.
and that's, yeah, right.
As much as you can, as you can. And you can't always, and I know that, and some chairs are immovable objects, and that's something you'll have to contend with.
Yeah.
So along the lines of, like you said, blindsiding with a question, or for questions that a board member may have for a superintendent or for the board or for discussion, what are some of the guidelines about having to warn it for a meeting discussion versus, hey, I have a question, I'd like to talk about it? When does that kind of stuff have to be brought up?
Well, it depends. That's kind of be my answer to everything, I think. If that's a conversation that you want to have with the board chair to advance your knowledge and understanding of your place as a board member, then that's something that the two of you can arrange to do privately. If you want something to be discussed at the board table, some board chairs will share the agenda, a preliminary agenda with all board members in advance of needing to warn, to make sure there's nothing you want to add. If there is if your chair does not do that and there's something you would like included on an agenda, you let the chair know. I think I'd really like to be having a conversation about because and make sure to identify if you've got a desired outcome or you just want to learn more about a topic, right? Because they're on an agenda, and we're all guided by Robert's rules. There are discussion items and there are action items. And best practice is that something on this month's discussion items might be on next month's or the month after action items, but you always have it up as a discussion item first. There are some really detailed, intricate exceptions to all of that. And sometimes things come up in the moment that the board chooses to vote on, and that's okay. But typically with open meeting law, the whole intent of open meeting law is transparency and making sure that the public has access to be able to comment prior to a board decision, if they choose to. Did
So
I
we
answer
got-
your question?
Yeah, I guess we had a former board chair who's no longer on the board that
They're the worst kind.
whenever somebody would start discussing something that wasn't on the agenda, she would shut it down and saying, we can't discuss it because it hasn't been warned. And it wasn't even some, I can understand if there's going to be a decision made, but some of these discussions were honestly not, they were discussions that just need to be had, and she didn't like it.
Were they about specifics about the school district, about something happening in the district?
Yeah, I guess I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
She pulled it so many times, it didn't seem like, it wasn't something that needed to be an executive session or anything like that. It was just like, I really don't want to be here. I'm going to shut it down. And the following chair was her protege. And so still a lot of that going on, but
Mhm.
now
Well,
we have a new chair, so it's going to be different, I guess. But, the board twice last year got in trouble for violations of open meeting law.
tell me again, Dan, what district you're in?
Caledonia Cooperative.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that's right. I remember those. So, given the fact that you've been busted on open meeting law a couple of times, you want to be on your best behavior about that, right? For the benefit of public trust. Forget the old chair, public trust is important. And therefore, every agenda ought to include a section called new business. And so if there's something that you want to be discussing, you bring it up as new business and it gets added to the next agenda.
Okay.
Does that help? Okay.
So last night at our board meeting, she said, we have an other at the end, and she said, it's only for announcements. And you can't use it for bringing up new business that you want to have for a future meeting. It has to be really cleared with her first, I think, via email.
Mhm. So that's okay if you understand that that's the protocol, that that's the way it works for this board. And so you can comply with that. But I would still say that at other is the time to say, I've been thinking about X, and I think it would be an interesting topic to be able to have discussion around at a future board meeting. Is it
Okay.
possible to add it to an agenda? And sometimes the chair may resist, but other board members might like it, in which case somebody can call a point of order and you take a vote
Right.
as to whether or not to include that topic. And
Right.
that's the kind of vote that doesn't need to be warned,
Okay,
right?
cool.
That's in the moment.
Yep.
Okay. Is that helpful?
Mhm.
Okay, excellent. By the way, our executive director, who is an attorney, did a great presentation for a particular board last week, I think it was, or the week before, on Robert's rules. And I intend to engage her to do a webinar, VSBA webinar. Probably it won't happen until we're into the next fiscal year. But so if you have questions about those intricacies, stay tuned. I'm not the expert, but I sat through that one, so I got some of it.
Well, I think it's the all these Zoom meetings and public Zoom meetings, some are broadcast on TV or recorded or
Mhm.
whatever historically anyway, but it's created a whole new challenge, because whether or not a board intentionally failed to comply with open meeting or not, I think in most cases it's unintentional, but if that happens, now it's recorded. People saw it, because my experience is more people are joining Zoom meetings than they were going to board meetings, which I think will be a loss going forward when we do go back to meeting
Right.
wherever we were before. But anyway, I mean, it's forced a lot of transparency that wasn't there before, or wasn't as easy to see before.
Yeah, and I think that has pluses and minuses, truthfully. Barbara, by the way, just set up in the chat. She had told me ahead at the beginning of the meeting that she had to leave early for a school commitment. So she apologizes to everybody. But I do think that the dynamics created by virtual meetings, yes, it is my impression also that more public is attending because it's easy for them to attend, which may lead to some hybrid version of future board meetings where the public can follow a stream or something as it's happening and also have the opportunity to comment. It's hard to know how it's all going to shake out. And there were temporary modifications made to open meeting law during the state of emergency that allow, for example, I mean, the biggest one probably is in regular open meeting law, you can have a virtual meeting as long as at least one person of the body, so one board member, attends the meeting in the location that's specified for the meeting. And so you may have public there with you, but be the only board member in the place because everybody else is attending virtually. Snowstorm, for example, or whatever. So I think the jury's out on how that's all going to shake out. But it has been a good reinforcement of open meeting law at its core, I think, to the point you're making, Dan, that we're conscious of being visible, because everybody else is right there. And different boards have been doing that differently too. Some stream their meetings. And if you're watching on YouTube, live stream, you can comment on YouTube and somebody's monitoring that chat. It's all over the place. So are there questions about what the board's role is here with budgeting and or finances? You guys all pretty comfortable with that?
I have a quick budgeting question that
Sure.
came up today from someone I was chatting with. We do the per student cost, and somebody was talking about how where special ed funding comes into play with that, because say you have $55,000 per student, and say you have 45 students in a school that are on IEPs, and you have 75% of those students who receive Medicaid. Medicaid pays for some of those services. So it was very confusing about where those student costs lie, and if their cost is $55,000 plus special ed money that is then supplemented by Medicaid. And then, so do you have any insight into that, or should we not take time up now and you can tell me where?
Well, so what I actually am going to suggest to you is to really get a handle on that. I'm not going to be your best resource. And I would speak to your superintendent and ask permission to have a conversation with your business manager.
Okay.
To help you understand special ed funding per se. because it is complicated and there's federal money involved and there's state money involved, just to your point. And how does
Especially
that?
complicated with this recovery program
Yes,
and
yes.
extended school year services because the pots are different and it's
Right.
complicated to parents about why they can't have both services and it's coming down to money.
Mhm, mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that's probably your best resource for that. And then you can be talking specifics about your own
Okay.
district.
Great.
But a partial answer is when the cost per pupil is calculated for the district-wide budget,
Mhm.
the number of pupils is not actually physical bodies.
Okay.
So we have in Vermont a weighting system because we know that special ed students and students whose first language is not English and students from poverty and high school students cost more to educate than pre-K is less than kindergarten, is less than,
Sure.
et cetera. And so based on the district's population, which is submitted to the Agency of Education on a regular basis, they provide you a weighted student count.
Okay. And that's what the weighted study is.
And right, so
Now I understand.
okay, so if the weighted student count is one of the tools that I was mentioning before as a result of that 25-year-old, 20-year-old lawsuit to try and equalize across. So if you have a really high incidence of free and reduced lunch kids in your school district, and I don't, right? Your kids cost more to educate. This is an equity issue. So you are going to be dividing by a different number than I'm going to be dividing by based on how that student count gets weighted.
Sure.
There are districts with no high schools in the state, and their cost per pupil weighting is different because high school students cost more to educate than elementary school students because they need more equipment and you got to outfit the science labs and all of it. So the weighting study that may have heard about that was thrown around in legislature this past session that ended on Friday, we will continue to be hearing about it because a big study, the weights that are being used now are old,
right,
and were created quite a long time ago and somewhat arbitrary. Nobody ever really did the science as to how much more expensive is a high school student than a grade school student. And so a study was undertaken, led by a professor at UVM, to measure all of that.
Mhm.
And also, so that we have in that study are new proposed weights. And a new one was also added, which is rurality, because it is more expensive to operate a rural school with fewer students who have to travel further than it is in Burlington,
Mhm.
where people walk to school, right? It's just more expensive. And so the legislature did not simply adopt the results of this study. They're going to figure out how to implement it over time, because for some districts, it will be a huge change in the student body count, the weighted count, which then has a huge impact on the taxes.
Mhm.
So some will really benefit and some will really hurt. And so it's not going to be done in 1 year.
Okay. That helps. Thank you.
Sure. So I think the important things to remember, and I'm sorry Barbara's not here, based on her question about granularity, is with everything the board does, and it's true with financial monitoring, what you're the board takes a really high level perspective of everything. So you want to know what's in your budget relative to your goals, but you don't need to know how much a pencil costs, right? I mean, there's a big gap between those two things. So you want to know if more resources are being allocated to X, Y, or Z because those are priorities that the board has established. Yes, you want to know that. But you don't need to be down in the weeds, you know. And for those of you who work in finance, I think you know what I'm talking about. Okay, and for those of you who don't work in finance, you don't want to be in the weeds because it's not comfortable there for most of us, even if you're comfortable with numbers and working with numbers. So that high level perspective is important, but make sure you get your questions answered. Like that example I gave before about the laptops. You want to know if some new program is embedded in your budget numbers that nobody's ever mentioned to the board. You know, if they're adding a new world language, you want to know about that, or reducing programs, whether it's eliminating some of the arts programs, or I mean, when I sat on the high school board, they were going to eliminate one of the more expensive sports teams. The entire team of 75 students and 5 coaches showed up at a board meeting to talk about how important this sport was to them. And the coach stood up and made a point because they missed a lot of school to do their sport. It was the ski team. And so they had to leave really early to be all over the state, and it had to happen in daylight hours. So they were missing school. And the coach just stood up and he said, look, of every sports team in this high school, we have the highest GPA. So what's the problem? And it was a pretty compelling argument. And by the way, I'll loop that story around to another issue that is important for board members, and that is a conflict of interest. Every board must have a conflict of interest policy, and it's incumbent on every board member to self-monitor, but it's also okay to monitor each other. So if somebody feels like you've got a conflict, even if you're not seeing it as a conflict, best to just recuse yourself. So in that case, when the whole team came, both of my kids were in that audience. I obviously recused myself. I was supporting that team through my own children. So my voice meant nothing there, and I wasn't going to chime in. So I'm not going to talk about understanding financial statements because you guys are good with them, right? The one thing, if you're accustomed to looking at for-profit financial statements, one thing that's a little bit different with schools is you see expenses first, because revenue becomes the plug, right? How much do we need to raise in taxes becomes a plug figure based on how much we're going to spend and where revenue is coming from elsewhere. Okay, so it's a little awkward in the beginning to get used to that. And typically, this is a pet peeve of mine. So when you do get monitoring reports quarterly or monthly, every board has a policy on how frequently. Sometimes it's the finance committee sees monthly statements, but the board only gets quarterly, however you work it. Typically, the budget is not broken out into time periods other than the fiscal year. And so when you're looking at variances in, October, they're kind of meaningless because you've got nothing to go, to benchmark against. And then you're getting close to the end of the fiscal year, and all of a sudden you're starting to see that some things are really out of whack that were never clearly a miss before. And that's, as soon as you notice it, that's when you start asking your questions, because one of the things that's really important is that the management, that would be your superintendent, and through him or her, the rest of the business office, how are they going to take care of this? We have this big variance. We've overspent on, transportation so much. where's that going to come from? How are we going to end the year solvent? And those are fair questions to ask. Do you have a plan? Have you figured that out? And what is the plan? They owe you that. And if the answer is, we'll figure it out, push them. Okay, because you are accountable to your taxpayers and you don't want to lose their trust, because then next year at budget time, you may not have their trust for a budget that's what the board has determined is best for the kids. So there is a separation of duties. I think if you're a numbers person, you understand how important that is, right? So the board approves the expenditures, the administration prepares the checks, and that's obviously delegated. The superintendent is not doing that. And then there is a treasurer of your board who releases the funds. And so 3 different people have their fingers in that, so that you can't be writing a check to yourself and cashing it. Similarly, you're required by statute to audit annually. So your books are subject to an annual audit. And the best thing a board member can do is understand how to read an audit and ask the right questions. So if something is highlighted in the audit as being an area of concern, maybe your reserves are building up too much, and the auditor recommends that you could use some of that to offset next year's taxes, or vice versa. In order to compensate for that big overage in transportation, you dipped into your reserves and now you're not really protected. They're going to recommend that you beef up those reserves, and that's going to also have to be in your next budget, or maybe you spread it out over 3 years, but make sure that it gets incorporated until you're back where you need to be. So, the audit is really a precaution, but it's also a gold star that you can share with the community when everything looks right. In the book the Essentials Workbook, there's a page there with questions to ask the auditor if you need that information. And that's just a little helpful thing. Unfortunately, we're running really late, so I'm going to bypass this case study. I hope you all had a chance to read it, but the question really boiled down to, okay, so the school district has a really important agenda for students, and we're also struggling because the number of students is dwindling. And so how can the board have its priorities and reflect the community's priorities without the budget going completely haywire, right? And so it's a question of prioritizing programs and tax rate growth. So if you don't think that your community, collectively, the board has a sense as to how much flexibility there is with the tax rates, right? And if you don't think that you're going to be able to sustain more than 3%, putting out a 5% budget just doesn't make sense, because it's not going to pass. So you've got to work with administration to find a way to incorporate the big priorities, and you might have to let some of them go, so that you can have a budget that's passed and have that to work with. Make sense? Okay. So I mentioned before, one of the big things for a school board is the partnership with the superintendent. And the relationship between the superintendent, the board, is critical. It's also not always easy, because the board sometimes feels like just a rubber stamp, and the superintendent sometimes feels simultaneously that the board is too deeply involved in operations, because it's so tempting, especially if you're a parent, right? And you have that window into what's going on in the school. So it's really important to stay in your lane and respect that you have hired the most qualified professional to manage education through your district and through your supervisory union. By statute, your superintendent is the CEO of your district and or supervisory union. So they're accountable for operations and providing educational leadership. And then they delegate through the building level administration, through the principals. So prior to the last time we got together, I sent out a 5-page document from the Agency of Education that outlines the roles and responsibilities of the superintendent, the school board, principals, teachers, and even board committees. And I encourage you to keep that nearby. It's handy just to glance back at it. And if you can't find it, let me know. I'm happy to send it out again. But basically, the board has that big picture, right? You set the goals, you make sure that there's good communication between the board and the administration, and then you monitor. The superintendent's the chief executive officer responsible for all operations and educational leadership, and ultimately is responsible to the supervisory union and district boards. And many districts are fond of saying, and I think it's a good reminder, the superintendent is the only employee of the board. The superintendent is responsible for all the other people. So the principals don't report to the board. The principals report to the superintendent. Superintendent reports to the board. And just having that fixed in your head, if you've ever been in a hierarchical situation, I think is a really good reminder of how these roles work together with one another. So boards, your job is to make sure that the schools are well run, but not to actually run the schools, right? You're making sure they're well run by hiring qualified people and giving them good direction. And then letting them be the professionals that they are, utilizing the skills and the knowledge that they have. And in fact, relying on the skills and the knowledge that they have. The chain of command is pretty obvious. Okay, the board has vision, policy, resources, and accountability to the community, works with the superintendent, who is the CEO, who works with the school level administration. And you'll notice that the board doesn't have a direct line to the principal. Now, there are exceptions to that, particularly in the districts that are single school in a district where the board works only about one school, and mostly those there aren't too many of those left, but there are still some. And in that case, the board and the principal usually do have a relationship because the board only has the purview of that one school in their sites. Does that make sense? Are any of you in that situation? A single town board? No. Okay. So hiring is an interesting one because, and actually there was a webinar last night, which I did not attend and I haven't had a chance to look at yet on exactly this, the board's role in the hiring process. Pretty much it's the superintendent's show, except that the board has final approval. So for licensed positions like teachers and principals, the superintendent nominates a single candidate. So they probably have a committee and they interview people and they go through this whole process and end up with one candidate to recommend to the board. And then the board either agrees or disagrees. For non-licensed staff, the board has nothing to do with it really. That would be your paraprofessionals, your custodial staff. If your district employs the food service folks, some do, some contract out. The non-licensed professionals. So not the non-teachers, the office staff, etc. The superintendent has the authority to dismiss, subject to your collective bargaining agreement, to your contract. And the board is the final place where things get resolved. So if you get involved too early in the process, you're really no longer impartial. So stay away until you need to be there. If there's a union grievance, you'll know it. But otherwise, and generally speaking, if there's a performance issue, particularly at the administrative level, so say a principal, the superintendent, as a courtesy, will share with the board what's about to go down. And we'll probably listen to the board if there's a real objection to an action that's being proposed. But again, it's not the board's job to get involved in that. So it is really a courtesy. So this case, and did you all have a chance to read through these and sort of digest the cases a little bit? This one was about the superintendent evaluation. And this seems so basic to me that sometimes I feel like, why do we even need to say this? But you do, because it isn't. So boards and superintendents set goals for the superintendent, right? It's a management thing. And we've all probably had performance goals at jobs, whether it's, how much you sell or a deadline or whatever it may be. There are certain expectations and they're clearly communicated with you, hopefully. Same should be true with the superintendent. They should know what the board is looking for from them over a time period. Let's go back to that third grade literacy, right? We are looking to see our 90% of our third graders at proficiency in literacy. That's our goal. And when we hired you, Madam Superintendent, it was at 53%. So after 1 year, we see it up to 60. Good job, right? Very clear goal. It's measurable. You can monitor the data and you can see the results. Great goal. The superintendent needs to be clear on what their goals are, and the board needs to be clear on what they're asking of the superintendent. And then there should be a formal evaluation process every year so that you can check in and monitor the progress on those goals, establish new goals, revise old goals. Sometimes the superintendent really needs to be working on their communication with their faculty. Like everything else is going well, but the faculty doesn't trust the superintendent. Well, that's a goal then that you would set for the superintendent, which is different than a goal you would set for the district, right? You still have that literacy goal, but that's all going along. That's moving. You've provided resources for literacy specialists at the elementary grades. That's all in place. The scores are doing, moving. It's all good. But the superintendent is annoying people. So you're going to revise their goals.
How do you know that if that's happening?
Oh, well, so
We recently had the evaluation for the superintendent, and it was sort of, everybody was in agreement that he was doing a great job, but I don't recall seeing these goals or knowing anything about what's happening, especially in the policy governance setting. Like, we really are trusting him to do that job. And then, I don't know what principals are doing as far as communicating with him,
Right. So policy governance, again, puts a slightly different spin on this. What I can tell you is one of the services that VSBA offers is a superintendent evaluation. And we do it in a way where maybe you use us once or twice, and then we've provided a framework for you to be able to carry that forward. And that framework that we use includes all board members having an opportunity to evaluate on a pretty extensive rubric that includes the superintendent's goals from last year. Also having the administrative team evaluate the superintendent. So there you will find out from principals if teachers aren't happy, et cetera. And you also have the superintendent self-evaluate. And then, we do the analysis and present it back to the board. And I think periodically, we recently had a panicked phone call from a school board chair because the faculty, the union, just surveyed its membership in that district, and there was a vote of no confidence in the superintendent. So you do know, when it gets really dramatic like that, it becomes a big issue.
Okay.
Because the board was satisfied with the superintendent, but the faculty isn't. And that puts the board in a tough spot, right? Because the superintendent was true to the goals that the board had set, but the goals that the board had set were not goals that were going to transfer to the faculty.
Mhm.
And so it got a little weird. They were goals around this weird year, and how to make, what the primary goal was, let's get our students back in school as much and as fast as we can, safely. And teachers didn't like that because they didn't feel safe.
Mhm.
And so the board then had to parse out, is this a single issue problem? Where there were just different priorities pressing different levers, or do we have a bigger issue here that's going to become a really unsustainable issue?
Okay.
In other words, can this superintendent change as a result, change the way, in this case, he is managing the situation with the faculty effectively, or how are we going to make this work moving forward, or not? Right? That's the board's question. But without the regular process of having at least an annual evaluation in place, you just don't have any benchmarks. And
The superintendent evaluation is going to happen at the SU level, right? Not the district.
correct. However, in our process that VSBA uses, all board members have an opportunity to complete that evaluation. The communication is with the SU board from us. We'll give the SU board the report of how everybody evaluated, and often that is it pretty nicely lends itself to defining next year's goals, because you find pockets of things that could be better than they are. And so we work with the district to establish goals, and it's transparent with the superintendent too, right? So everybody has to accept the same goals. If the superintendent has goals that are defined for him or her, then and they don't buy in, you've got a mess on your hands, right? So it has to be done collaboratively, and they have to agree on that. But so the district boards are involved in terms of input, and presumably your representation to the SU board will also share with you the report, the results of all of that data. Okay, so I'm going to leave that alone. Now, at the end of the last meeting, Katie had asked a little bit about policy governance. Asha, your board is not policy. Oh, you are. Tell me again where you are.
Yes, I'm at the Mill River Unified Union.
Of
School
course.
District
Okay. Okay.
Representative.
Got it.
I'm on our policy committee.
Policy committee, but not policy governance.
No.
Okay. And Dan, you're not either. So policy governance is it's a complete package. It's a comprehensive set of integrated principles that allows governing boards, like a school board, to identify that the owners of the school district are really your taxpayers and that you're accountable to them. So the policies are really broad and implementation is completely left to the administration's interpretation of those policies. And then if the board doesn't agree with that interpretation, if it's contrary to what they were looking to do, they can create a more limited policy until, in fact, they jive with the superintendent's understanding. But there's a real delineation between whose job is what, and nobody crosses it. So there are policies that are called ends policies, which are those that address the benefits that you're looking for whom and at what cost. That's an ends policy. They don't relate to what we're going to do or how we're going to do it, but rather the difference that we intend to make in people's lives, which in non-policy governance terms, we call them a vision statement. And the other policies, anything that isn't an ends policy in policy governance is called a means policy. And that's the practices and the methods and the conduct and other activities that are necessary to pursue those ends. And if you look at this chart, it's a little confusing, but those operational means policies are in the quadrant of superintendent, right? Clearly superintendent. And then the board is responsible for the governance and board management policy. So board management becomes a bigger piece of that discussion in policy governance. So this is just sort of a quick comparison. Traditionally, we tend to have a lot of policies. Policy governance prefers to have fewer broad policies. Traditionally, we tend to be reactive in our policies. Policy governance tries to be proactive, reflecting the community's values. Traditionally, we tend to focus on operations, even though it's not the purview of the board. Policy governance focuses on results, and so it goes. But it is a comprehensive, full-on package, and it is very proscribed. It was developed by a man named John Carter, and he and his wife traveled around the country promoting policy governance. And when it works well, it works really well. As I was saying to Katie before the meeting, if you have a very strong superintendent and a board that really believes in that person's expertise, you can work really well together by having clearly delineated roles. But if either of those is out of balance, it doesn't work so well. Does that help, Katie?
This chart alone is really helpful.
Excellent. Good. And so to Asha and Dan, you may hear about policy governance, not probably in the context of your own board meeting, but if you start to engage with board members from other districts like Katie, you're going to hear about it, and just know that it's a whole system of governance. And some boards are moving towards it, others have given up on it. It's not a panacea. And it's not the right answer for everybody. So I raced through an awful lot and I did a ton of talking, but is there anything else? So are we really going to get together again in 2 weeks? And I'm happy to do that, to just have an open forum, anything that we haven't covered or questions that you have, or I'm happy to do that. Does that work for most of you? I think, I'm not sure if you were here already when we decided we would just stay with the Tuesday 5 o'clock thing, and I'll schedule it for June 8th. And you can drop in and out if it's the right thing for you. And I don't know where everybody else was tonight, but maybe they can make it then. I just want to make sure that everybody feels like you understand what you've got yourselves into, and that you know where to find the resources that you need. And mostly that you just feel on top of it. So when you walk into a board meeting, you don't kind of go in all hunched over trying to hide, but you feel confident about why you're there.
Yeah, I would love a third. I think this is so beneficial. It's been really helpful.
Wonderful. So I'll set it up, but I'm not going to have a PowerPoint. I'm not going to pick my
Sure.
topics. It's your topic. So, organize your thoughts and your questions and bring them with you. And in the meantime, we did put together a survey for your feedback, because we do this with every program that we run, so that we can keep making sure what we're offering makes sense, that it's working for you, and that we can improve the areas that would benefit from some improvement. So I've got the link in the slide, but I know it's not interactive. Carrie is going to put that in the chat. Right, Carrie? Oh, she already did. Okay.
It's
so
there. I was
thank you.
doing it while you were saying it.
Perfect. So thank you for that. And I'll also be sending out a follow-up email just with the information about the June 8th meeting, and I'll put that link in there as well. It'll be the same link. So appreciate your feedback. It's I don't know, maybe 8 questions. They're not long, they're not hard. It just, did we hit the mark, or did we miss the mark? And how can we make it better? Okay. And again, in between now and June 8th, or anytime, any place, well, maybe not anytime, don't ever hesitate to get hold of me. If I'm not the right person, I'll send you to my colleague who is. If it's a legal question, I'm not going to touch it. If it's a policy question, you're probably better off with Sandra, who's our Director of Public Policy. But we're only 4 people on staff, but we cover a pretty broad range of knowledge and expertise, and we are happy to take calls and emails from all board members at any time. So if it's a question about your role and not sure how you should be handling something like getting an item on the agenda, check in with us. We're happy to handle it. Happy to walk you through that. Okay. So it's 7:04, not too bad since we got a late start. Now I'm going to go drink about a gallon of water. I hope it's still light out. It's still beautiful. Go out and get some fresh air while we have it. And I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much, Susan. Thank you.